Hello, historians, and welcome to another Purple Shirt History. Today we'll be talking about the Great Crash, the Depression, and the New Deal policies. This is quite a dark time in American history. Many people lost their jobs, had to live in poverty, and it eventually led to the worldwide conflict that was World War II. This video is intended for the Cambridge AS curriculum, but if you're studying another exam board or if you're in IGCSE, it should also be quite useful. Please let other students find this video by hitting like and subscribe. It really helps us get put up through the algorithm. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. Now, sit back, relax, grab your notebook and a drink, and let's learn about the bad times in America during the Great Depression.
The Great Crash, Great Depression, and New Deal policies. If you've taken IGCSE history, which I'm assuming you would, you should be comfortable in this particular section now. You probably didn't know much about the Civil War origins, the war itself, Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, but now you should have some background because this is in the territory of studies that you've done in IGCSE. The chapters in IGCSE that you should go over are chapters 2 and 3. Those are the ones that will coordinate with this particular part of the assessment. Looking at the agenda for today, what were the causes of the Great Crash? Many different causes. It can't be simplified just down to one thing. There are many major things, but you can't put everything on one particular aspect like Wall Street or overexpansion of agriculture or consumer credit. All these things work together to lead to the Great Crash. What were the causes and impacts of the Great Depression? All extremely negative, both domestically in the US and worldwide. As the US becomes more isolationist and protectionist, we see fascism flourish in Europe. We see Japan take a much more belligerent course. So it's very devastating for everyone in the world. It'll lead to, of course, World War II and tens of millions of deaths. How effective were Roosevelt's strategies to deal with the domestic problems facing the USA in the 1930s? Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes president in early 1933, and he immediately starts to take action against the Depression. This is seen quite different to the actions of the Republican president, Herbert Hoover, who came before FDR. We're going to see this new type of governmental intervention, Keynesian economics, creating money and pumping it into the economy, which is a lot more interventionist than the traditional American laissez-faire government. This is a big political and cultural shift for America. There's going to be more than one New Deal program, so we'll go over that in detail soon. When you see that term domestic problems there, the number one problem of the Great Depression is unemployment. One word answer, very simple. Please remember that. What's the biggest problem of the Great Depression? Unemployment. People can't earn money, they can't buy anything, they don't have any disposable income, they're just on sustenance wages or savings or handouts. It's very brutal for the economy and it causes a vicious circle. No one can buy anything, which causes companies to shut down, which causes more unemployment, and so on and so forth. Why was there opposition to the New Deal policies and what impact did it have? As just mentioned, this is a huge cultural and political change in America. Normally, they think, oh, the market will just sort things out. But FDR said, no, people are suffering. The Democrats wanted to be much more interventionist and create new programs, new agencies, and get people back to work through the public sector, not the private sector. Public is government jobs, and private is for individual companies. What were the causes of the Great Crash? Structural weaknesses in the US economy in the 1920s. Example given, disparity between agricultural, traditional, and new industries. As we mentioned in the previous video about the Gilded Age, American economics is very boom-bust throughout the course of its history. So there's just maddening bull runs that everybody's making money and it seems there's endless optimism. Next thing you know, everybody loses confidence and the economy plunges. One case in point was the Panic of 1873, a huge depression-like economic contraction. These weaknesses are because the government doesn't really intervene too much in the market. The market is a wild ride for many people. And we see in the 1920s, more people are becoming involved in the market. Everyday normal people starting to trade stocks. We have people having access to consumer credit for the first time and buying things that they can't afford. In agriculture, people expanding their farms, buying new equipment like tractors. John Deere is a company that you may be familiar with. They are active in this time period as well. It's a very old company. So the farmers in the countryside buy too much land, they buy too much equipment, and the prices they get for their goods, their agricultural products, is too low to pay back the loans. There's just an overstretch of financial resources for so many people on credit and loans. It just is ripe for a disaster. Let this be a lesson to you. Don't spend more money than you have. Be very financially prudent. Traditional and new industries, we see something like the automobile industry under Henry Ford become extremely rich and ubiquitous in American life. The Model T, the first really popular mass produced automobile. This is going to displace horses and buggies, streetcars, other types of transportation. So we see those people lose jobs, and this new industry of automobiles in Detroit really become a powerful force in the American economy. We see with the expansion of America, there's a huge demand for steel and coal and other industrial products. When the country is growing less, if there's going to be a downturn in the demand for raw industrial materials, we'll see that those industries will hurt as well. So it's all very fragile. It's all depending on supply and demand, or even manipulations, stock manipulation in the 1920s. I'm going to put a book that I read this past year in the description, and it's about the arguably greatest stock trader who ever lived named Jesse Livermore. And it's just absolutely a bonkers story. So highly recommend. My highest possible recommendation for a book, The Reminiscences of a Stock Operator, I will put in the description, and you can check out the Wild West that was Wall Street back in those days. Growth of consumerism, example given, higher purchase and buying on the margin. Credit cards are invented around this time period, or credit itself. So you can go to a department store, you see some furniture you like, it costs $100, you only have $5 in your pocket. So you give them the $5 and then you can pay on installments. If you don't have any money and you can't pay back that other $95, it's a problem for you because you are now in default, but it's also a problem for the department store because they lost a large amount of capital. Well, $95 may not seem like a large amount, but imagine if thousands of people start defaulting on their loans. So you loaned out $100 to 1,000 people. Now you're out of a lot of money. So this extension of credit to the masses is a big economic boom in the short term, but we see people overextend themselves and a lot of defaults start to come in. And people start to buy stocks on margin. When you guys get older and you open up a brokerage account and you start buying stocks, they will offer you margin. They will offer you money. So if you have a $50,000 account, they'll probably give you $50,000 of margin. If you buy $100,000 of some EV stock that goes out of business, your money evaporates. And the brokerage firm that lent you that $50,000 is now out of that capital. These are the types of things that we see are just fuel for the crash. When everybody is overextended, there's euphoria on Wall Street. There is an idea of these roaring 20s will last forever. And people are spending like there's no tomorrow without the ability to pay things back in the future. Mass production and oversupply. This era in American history is where we start to see the efficiency of the American industrial scientists or productivity experts. There's another book about productivity that I should put in the description. Companies want to hire as few people as possible because it will reduce their wage bill. They want to replace them with machines, which will never call in sick, can work for many, many years. They won't go on strike, and so on and so forth. With the increase of efficiency in American capitalism, we see more layoffs, more people being put out of work. It's a strange one. It's a good thing to be productive, to be competitive as an American company against the British companies, the German companies, and so on and so forth. But the average worker may lose out in that particular situation. Not only will there be fewer workers, but the companies can also produce more goods with those fewer workers. In this case, we see supply glut. There's so much supply, the demand cannot soak it all up, and this is going to cause problems and bankruptcies for some businesses. Impact of government policies. There are very few government policies. As mentioned, it's laissez-faire, which means just let it go, let it be. People are borrowing money without much regulation. People are spending money without much regulation. It's all a bit of a free-for-all. It's not until October of 1929 that we see this was a bad idea. And the crash starts to materialize. A panic ensues. Most historians are in consensus that the Great Depression really wasn't brought to an end by American government policies. It was brought to an end by the entry of the US into the war. What were the causes and impacts of the Great Depression? The main features of the Great Crash in October of 1929 are what we just stated. There was an oversupply of goods and there was too much credit. There was an overextension of credit. Eventually, that credit was exhausted. Consumers couldn't buy anymore, and producers needed to contract their operations, which led to layoffs and then a vicious cycle downward. Tying this into what you learned in IGCSE, America was providing the loans to Germany to pay back the reparations to Britain and France for World War I. So as soon as the crash happened, you start to see the ending of loans to Germany, which then caused massive financial hardship there, also in France and Britain because they weren't getting their money for the reparations, and we see a global depression happening. Responses of Hoover government and industry to the Great Crash. Hoover is a Republican. So in the 1920s, we see a series of Republican administrations after the last Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover are the three Republican presidents, and it's very business-led. Industry is kind of controlling politics at this time. Industry wants support. The Hoover government is in a bit of a bind ideologically because it was supposed to be laissez-faire, let the businesses do what they want to do, and everyone would be prosperous. But we're starting to see this type of attitude change. And even Hoover, towards the end of his administration, will start to do this supply side kind of economics. The Hoover Dam is built to power the city of Las Vegas today. And there are some other big projects by the Hoover government to get people back to work, but not nearly on the scale needed to alleviate the situation. Collapse of the financial system. The financial system during this time, it doesn't have the regulatory oversight and lender of last resort that it does today. All of those systems will be put in place later to prevent another great crash like this. But at the time, there is no federal deposit insurance corporation, there's no social security, there's nothing, right? And there isn't anything really to underpin the whole system. It's working without a net, so to speak. The Dow Jones Industrial Averages plunges throughout October and November of 1929. It won't be until decades later that the Dow Jones reaches its all-time high again. So this shows you how long-lasting the effect of the collapse was. People's entire life savings are wiped out. It's all incredibly grim. Mass unemployment and its social impact, example given, Hoovervilles and employment discrimination. Maybe in your English literature classes, you've come across the novels of John Steinbeck, like Of Mice and Men or Grapes of Wrath. These types of books talk about the itinerant workers. Hoovervilles are just groups of tents of homeless people. Employment discrimination, we see people roving from town to town, trying to get work, moving to the coast, especially California, to do menial jobs. There's also the Dust Bowl going on at this time. So as if the Great Depression wasn't bad enough, you can Google the Dust Bowl. Basically, the topsoil of a large percentage of the middle of America gets blown away. Many things are going wrong at this time. And it's reflected in the social impact. It's reflected in the culture. There's the gangster era. So I don't know if you've seen the movie Public Enemies with Johnny Depp. Even people who are robbing banks are kind of seen as heroes because the banks were overlending and doing practices that weren't regulated. In America, there's a lot of different undercurrents. We see socialism look good to a lot of people, which should be stated that the Soviet Union in the 1930s was kind of the opposite of America. It was really booming. They were building cities, employment was high, and so on. So people were looking at America and thinking, oh, maybe we're the worst system. It's just leading to unemployment and poverty and misery. And Stalin, he looks like a great leader building all of these industrial cities and metro systems in Moscow and Leningrad and these types of places. So the social impact was very severe. How effective were Roosevelt's strategies to deal with the domestic problems facing the USA in the 1930s? The first 100 days are known for their massive amount of activity. So the first thing he does is shut down all the banks to see which ones are financially solvent and which ones will not survive. So there's bank holidays being put in place. He does these things called fireside chats. People don't know how the financial system works, even today. That being said, Roosevelt tells people how banking works. The bank only has a very small percentage of its deposits in actual liquid assets. They take money from you and they reinvest it somewhere else, which leads it to a lot of risk. de-risking the banking system with this FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is a massive New Deal project. Today, I think it's up to $250,000 of your money is safe in an American bank. So if it's FDIC insured, that's what makes it very attractive for people to put their money in America because the government backs it up to a certain dollar amount. Development of New Deal policies and the need for a second New Deal. So the first New Deal is just about stabilizing the economy. The second New Deal will actually be about building the economy back up. Recovery of American economic fortunes. The first New Deal cleans up the banking sector and the finances of America. And the second one is about getting people back to work. So you'll have all these things called alphabet agencies. WPA, there's the Public Works Program. There are all these awesome murals and stuff all around the US. I want to take a road trip one of these days and kind of, I don't know if it's specifically a New Deal road trip, but I would like to see a lot of these cool things that were made, murals and art around the US that are almost 100 years old now from the Second New Deal. We see conservation efforts. We see public works in America's national parks. The Wagner Act has to do with collective bargaining, forming unions, and these types of things that were big issues during the Progressive Era, as we mentioned in the previous video. A lot of different things in the New Deal wanted to get people back to work and ensure that they had rights in the workplace, as well as marginalized or at-risk groups such as senior citizens. By far the most popular program Roosevelt does during the New Deal is the Social Security Act. Tens of millions of elderly Americans every month collect Social Security insurance, and that's what they live off of. So you pay a tax during your working life, and you collect the interest from your taxation in old age. Social Security is a pension scheme that millions of Americans depend on even to this very day. Roosevelt's political strategies, example given, the New Deal Coalition. The New Deal Coalition was the voting bloc for FDR. It comprised of various groups. So let's go over some of them together. Labor unions. Blue-collar workers were big fans of FDR because he was putting them back to work. He supported unions, the Wagner Act, all of these rights to strike, to demand better conditions and wages. So that was a primary component of the New Deal Coalition. Urban ethnic groups were another key component. People that just came from Ireland or Poland or were from Jewish areas across Europe and coming to America. They all supported the Democratic Party because it was a lot more inclusive than the Republicans were. And it focused on working class people, which since these people came from Europe or other parts of the world with very little, these policies that FDR was promoting would benefit them greatly. African American voters voted Republican from the time of Abraham Lincoln, but with the New Deal Coalition, FDR really made inroads and made African Americans key Democratic voters, and this is still the case in 2024. Farmers were a key part of the New Deal Coalition because FDR, he bought the excess from the farmers, the agricultural products, which helped stabilize prices, reduce the surplus, gave credit to struggling farmers, and really valued small farmers as an important part of the country. Southern whites were part of the New Deal Coalition. We see a lot of things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which gave electricity to really remote parts of Appalachia around Tennessee. No private company wanted to build this electricity there because it wasn't profitable. So this was a big deal for the area and for the New Deal because it tackled problems that private companies would not do. Didn't need to turn a profit. It was just to get people back to work and to provide benefits for the people in the area. Intellectuals and academics, by and large, were supportive of the New Deal due to the fact that the Roosevelt administration was attempting to look at things scientifically. We had John Maynard Keynes. I mentioned Keynesian economics. Look him up. There was a lot of intellectual ferment and an appreciation of new ideas, which contrasted with the conservatism of the Republicans at the time. Reasons for the Roosevelt recession/depression of 1937-38. The first reason was there was cutbacks to the New Deal programs. A lot of the programs were incredibly generous, creating jobs where there weren't really a need for them, such as getting men to sweep leaves up. It didn't create a lot of economic output. It helped solve unemployment a little bit by getting that person back into work, but it didn't really have a lot of productive economic gain. So the cutbacks in the New Deal programs did lead to this recession/depression. I mentioned before that Social Security is a pension scheme, so taxes needed to be raised to fund this scheme. Getting the program up and running with payroll taxes for businesses led to less employees being able to be hired and the growing pains of Social Security, also led to an economic downturn for Roosevelt in these years. Monetary policy also played a factor. Remember, we said there was a bank holiday. We needed to look at all the banks and see which ones would be solvent. They were required to raise the amount of capital they had on hand to make sure they would be more sturdy if there was a stress test, if there was any other economic downturn. Raising the capital requirements led banks to loan less, and that led to this downturn as well. Inventory recession, again, it's the same problem. Looking back in history, there's usually downturns when there's not enough food, when there's not enough workers, when there's not enough of anything. It's a bit of a strange one in the 1930s in America because there are workers. It's a problem of plenty rather than a problem of want. So it's one to think about. Business confidence was somewhat low in these years, and these empowered workers were more emboldened to strike after the Wagner Act. So capital-labor relations were pretty fraught, and businesses didn't want to expand their operations during these years. Why was there opposition to the New Deal policies and what impact did it have? Starting from the left, the liberal left thought that many of the New Deal policies did not go far enough. There were many opponents on the left to the New Deal and what FDR was doing, but I'm going to just mention one guy because, in my opinion, he's the most interesting. Again, another great book that I will put in the description. His name was Huey Long, and he was the governor of Louisiana. He had a nickname called the Kingfish. FDR called Huey Long the most dangerous man in America. Huey Long was a populist, a person giving easy answers to people. He was consolidating power in Louisiana, ignoring federal law. He had his own kind of secret police. And I didn't really know all this stuff until just a year or two ago. This was a COVID read that I had when I was stuck at home. So I read The Kingfish, and Huey Long it's terrifying. He was very undemocratic, and he tried to run for federal office for president eventually, but he was assassinated. So the story of Huey Long that deserves its own video, but know who he is because he was an incredibly charismatic and dangerous opponent for FDR. Opposition to the New Deal from the right makes a lot more sense. It is from big business and Republican politicians. People that don't want to see workers get rights, people that don't want to see collective bargaining, and thinking that this is creeping socialism. So Roosevelt is some kind of sphinx. That was his nickname. Nobody knew what he was doing, and eventually we would have all of our freedoms taken away and blah, 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 scaremongering. A lot of the people on the right thought Roosevelt was acting way beyond his mandate. They tried to stop the New Deal and were successful in limiting it. All in all, the conservatives, it makes a lot more sense for them to be ideologically opposed to the New Deal. Opposition from the Supreme Court. There are a number of alphabet agencies that get shut down by the Supreme Court. So one is the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA. Another is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So the most effective way to stymie the New Deal on the Republican side was to put it up to the Supreme Court, which was controlled by conservatives, and have these agencies and acts struck down as unconstitutional. It got so intense that FDR was thinking of packing the court with more judges. So there's 9 Supreme Court judges. He was going to add more judges, enough to get his legislation passed and not be overturned by the Supreme Court. This did not happen, but it was floated by the executive branch and real thought was put into it. How did FDR respond to all of this opposition? So we mentioned the court packing plan. The Supreme Court, I think, was his number one enemy during this time. Another way he pushed things through was through the New Deal coalition. With such a broad base, he appealed to a lot of people, so he could rally public support to influence getting things through Congress, expanding federal authority. All these new agencies were created by him, and they were packed with his people. The SEC would report to FDR and be more willing to do what he wanted to do. He maintained a strong hold on the Democratic Party throughout his incredibly long tenure as president. So from 1933 to 1945, there's a constitutional amendment that says you can only serve 2 terms unless something happens. FDR should be the last person to do it. And last but not least, the international situation is darkening. So Hitler comes to power in 1933. We see the invasions of China in 1931 and 1937. We see Mussolini invade Abyssinia. So you know all that from IGCSE. So everything is starting to come together in your IGCSE and A-level knowledge. You should have a very strong idea of what's going on all around the world in the 1930s by now. All right, to wrap up, understanding the content, Black Tuesday. Remember, in your answer, there is a lot of different evidence you can give as to why the crash happened. There's internal factors, there's weaknesses on Wall Street, structural problems, there's greed, there's new inventions, new lines of credit, euphoria, the kind of Great Gatsby high life, devil may care attitude, spending on consumer goods, new inventions like cars and refrigerators and all that kind of stuff. The party has to stop sometime, the music ends, and that's when the crash begins. The Depression was just such a bedeviling problem for presidents to solve, Hoover and FDR. I mentioned before, during the entire 1930s, you can argue the United States is in the Great Depression. Despite all of the work that's done, it really doesn't end. It takes a massive global event like World War II to get the United States out of the Great Depression. FDR and the New Deal, then recovery. So the first New Deal, relieve those suffering. Unemployment is the biggest problem. Getting people back to work, getting the economy going, throwing out the old ideology of laissez-faire and having the government create jobs, which was a big ideological difference from what came before. John Maynard Keynes and supply side economics. Relief first, the second New Deal was to recover for the long term.